for senior citizens. And as a member, and by the way, the Justice Center is a wonderful enterprise within CSG that I encourage you to learn more about. We may have a chance to talk about that a little bit more during our meeting. Next in line, in the middle, seated in the middle, is Senator Kevin Coughlin from Ohio. And Senator Coughlin has represented Summit County in the Ohio Senate since 2001. Previously, he served 2 terms in the Ohio House of Representatives. He is chairman of the Senate Health, Human Services, and Aging Committee, and he serves as co-chair of the Council of State Governments International Committee and as a member of CSG's Executive Committee. He is the past chair of the CSG Midwestern Legislative Conference. For 5 years, Senator Coughlin co-chaired CSG's Bowie Institute for Legislative Leadership Development. Many of you know that as BUILD, which trains 33 Midwestern legislators every year to be strong leaders, and he is also a Toll Fellow, and BUILD and Toll have a lot of similarities for those of you that have been through one or the other of these premier CSG leadership programs. If you aren't familiar with them, ask about them because they're tremendous opportunities. Also, we were going to be joined by Senator David Williams, who is the Senate President in Kentucky and who is also our CSG Vice Chairman currently. However, this interbranch thing reared its ugly head again. The governor called a special session and told Senator Williams that he was not only doing that, because the senator called me the other day and said he was still planning to come, but the governor said we're having a joint session on Monday night and guess who needs to preside? So he unfortunately couldn't be with us. However, a gentleman who was previously planning to come anyway probably should be back there for that meeting, but was gracious enough to keep his commitment to be here, and is joining the panel is Senator Dan Kelly, who is the majority floor leader in Kentucky since 2000, the year 2000. He served in the Senate since 1991, and he's the recipient of many honors and awards, including the Teacher Leader Award for his early literacy intervention program. He's also a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve. So would you please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
Are we ready to rumble? Yeah. What is this rabble-rousers, Kim? No, we're here because we care. We're here because we're from the government and we want to help. I just want to say, by way of a sort of a segue into this session, that it is true that our obligation is to focus on obstacles, and I suspect each one of you can create your parade of horribles rather quickly, certainly in your states, and so it far be it for me to delve into areas that I don't know in that parochial sense. But I think it is appropriate that we sort of look and step back and say, what is the business of government in this 3 branches, and how are the challenges laid out that are, frankly, in some cases, barriers that are extremely difficult to overcome. Dan and I were joking about this, but I think one way to overcome the barriers, by the way, is to have a judge pick you up at the airport when you've got a senator and you've got an executive branch member and a judge driving you. I mean, there's harmony there in ways that you just can't appreciate. In thinking about, I come from a background as a lawyer. I used to be a prosecutor, and so I have a little sense of the judicial, but I don't presume to know much about that branch. However, I thought it would be appropriate to sort of get into that issue in terms of relationships between the judiciary and the other 2 branches. Kim, when you mention mandatory sentences, I think it's fair to say that this is an outgrowth of a lack of appreciation for the real balance that needs to occur in a democracy. We know that these are co-equal branches, but we also recognize that the perception of the democracy for which we serve, the people, oftentimes can skewer those balances and create an imbalance politically. And I would say to you, the first barrier that we're dealing with is the politics around some of these matters. And to say, and to pass over that or to gloss over that would be to do so at our peril. The politics around the judiciary as it involves itself in legislative function, as it's perceived by legislators, is a real concern, and it is a real barrier. And I would say to you that, I come from a state, you all are aware of this, that, a Supreme Court and a very divided court essentially allowed same-sex marriage to occur in our state. And that, to state the obvious, was an extraordinary implication to both public policy and one can fairly say the role of the other branches, in particular the legislative branch, to to deal with matters, of such import. And the fact of the matter is that I think actually the legislative experience in Massachusetts was interesting because as much as we are perceived, and I would dare say appropriately so, as a very liberal state, it took 4 years of constitutional meetings within the legislative branch to sort of get how we were going to resolve some of the amendment issues to the Constitution that might react to the judicial decision. And I will tell you this, I think the barrier that was created by that decision was probably one that was grounded not just in the rather surgical focus of the court and in a very divided decision, but also a recognition that the judiciary did not perceive and constitutionally did not feel it was necessary to look to the other two branches of government in either getting direction or getting any implication for what they were about to do or any sense of the politics of that. It simply was done in a unilateral and, in their view, an appropriate way. And I would tell you that I think that the conversation around the politics of that in my state were actually better than perhaps it would have been had it been in your state. I don't know, not being from California, exactly how it's playing out there, but there's no doubt that the implication of a decision of that nature is going to emanate into the legislature sooner or later, if not prophylactically by constitutional amendments in advance, as we've seen in many states, or more likely reactive to decisions that might occur. So I would say that the politics of that is a barrier that is just fundamental to the way our Constitution's set up, and we have to recognize that these things are going to happen, and if your court, in my court's a non-elective court. I mean, I just kind of apparently speak to this. Sharon Keller, who's a dear friend and is the vice chair of the Justice Center Board of Directors, she's an elected judge in Texas, and I come from a state where we don't elect any judges at all. But I will tell you that even though that is the case, to suggest that there's no politics in the business of the judiciary is at best to be naive and fundamentally misses what are then the politics that occur in a state that has non-elected judges. The politics involve rather crass things at times, which is an attempt to deal with the politics around judicial pay raises. I mean, we have a state that says that those pay raises are going to occur as a vote of the legislature, and we have done, which I suspect most states have tried to do one way or another, is get these compensation commissions to diffuse both those salaries for judiciary, but also to the legislators and to the executive branch. And that's just the way you need to overcome that. But I will tell you that in the case of the politics around judicial salaries, I have seen in my state rather blunt conversation and negotiation around pay raises as it affects other things the judiciary does. And that's a real challenge for a state like mine. We don't have the same dynamic of having those judges then speak to people directly in terms of a campaign, but it is a barrier, I would say, overall, the politics of how you do your work between judiciary and the other branches. But I thought, because I've now made a transition from legislature to executive, I could relate to you another interesting observation about a barrier that occurs between the executive and the legislative branch. Coming from the legislature, I'm the only member of the governor's cabinet, there are 8 of us, who has a legislative background of at least any recent vintage. And I will tell you that I was surprised at the level of misunderstanding of the role of the legislature in the way our government works in our state. And that misunderstanding, by the way, I think is fundamental to what we're trying to accomplish in this Interbranch Summit and in the work we do in our states. And that is the misunderstanding of what not only is the literal role of the legislature in dealing with budgets and dealing with some of the statutory challenges that executives have to deal with, but it is much more fundamental than that. I think it's a lack of appreciation for the co-equal role of a legislature in determining public policy. We have a state that that has a a government right now, an executive branch, that really doesn't see the role of the legislature as being, or hadn't seen that as being that critical. We have made great strides in the last 18 months, but I will tell you the barrier came from an election process where, the governor was running against the legislature. Now, you see that all the time in your states. I think that political dynamic is an evergreen. It's one that's never going to change. But it is one that is real. And I would tell you that I think the way to overcome that, and I do want to insert my suggestion in that regard, is that you ought to recognize that your executive branch, probably, you assume this is true, but it probably is not the case, that they have an intimate understanding of the role of a legislator. Let me give you just one example of that. How many times have we seen governors looking at a budget process, and at a moment in time when the veto pen gets out, especially when you have line item vetoes, that the elemental need to target that, that cut or the line item veto to a conversation with that legislator prior to that act happening. That is exactly the way a lot of governors still do it. And I find that amazing, that you would go ahead and take out a legislator's efforts in a budget process without giving them fair warning. This is practiced quite a bit, and I will tell you that in my state it was practiced quite a bit. I think in the second budget cycle we had a whole different attitude about it. But I think it's a recognized fact that in the exercise of veto authority, there are going to be moments of time when even with good faith, proactive, reaching out to the members, that you're going to have a difference of opinion as to whether there's an appropriateness to that, that item in the budget. But in the absence of the communication, I think the lack of communication becomes the process for which you really have a problem between the branches. Let me just say, because obviously I want to pass this off to Kevin and Dan, that I would tell you that if I had to describe the biggest barrier that I see in my state, and I suspect having gone around and working with the judge and other members of the other branches nationally, it's a lack of communication. I mean, there's no other way I could distill it better. How many times do judges say, I really would, I have a real strong opinion about something with regard to even something as basic as how do I run my court, where are the resources, how do I engage, that there just is no way to penetrate the branch that is most likely to be their problem, because they see that there are they perceive ethical barriers, they perceive difficulty in their role. I mean, are judges supposed to be able and are comfortably able to have conversation with members of the House or the Senate on matters that directly affect their work? I would say that indeed the lack of communication oftentimes overrides the substantive basis for any of the problems that you have between the branches. And I would say to you that in the effort that we've done, and we're going to do in this 2 days, and actually the material that was given to us was rather illustrative, and I guess that's my last comment. If you read the paper that was given out that spoke to Colorado, there is nothing new in this science. There's nothing new in this process of government. These are recurring challenges. The simple truth is that these obstacles are real. They do affect the ability of the government to function well. And I would just also, I guess, end by saying, Dan, offline, we were talking about how in Kentucky, litigation is often a way to resolve some of those obstacles. And that, that poses its own set of challenges. So suffice to say that I think that the obstacles that we see around us are very either inherent or barriers that are extremely high, and that they need to be overcome by a combination of efforts that I think each of us are making in our own way. So with that, I turn it over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Michael. Do this in stereo here. Michael mentioned our ride last night, and I covered our first experience with interbranch collaboration at this meeting, and the goal, the secondary goal of I think our trip in for the airport was to find dinner. Sunday night in Bismarck. As you can imagine, it was, I think we came down to the third option, the third choice, which sounds a little bit like the outcome of collaboration in state government back in Ohio. Often you don't get your first choice. The other thing that we share, another bit of cross-branch collaboration, so to speak, is our love of the Boston Celtics. Despite the fact that
There's no gloating over here.
yeah,
I'm not even wearing green, if you noticed.
despite the fact that one of my neighbors back home is a young man named LeBron James, I've been a lifelong Celtics fan long before LeBron was born, but happy to see the outcome there. I am. This is my second time to Bismarck, and I'm 2 for 2 in speaking engagements. Believe it or not, I love it when I hear things for the first time, and I'm going to say something, a combination of words that if you're not from North Dakota, you've probably never heard anyone say this before. When I was 15, I spoke to about 1,500 people over at the Bismarck Civic Center, which not too many 15-year-olds who aren't from North Dakota probably have had that experience. My mom even fished out a picture of me doing this, which is a little embarrassing. But she said, "Yeah, you should put this up on the screen and let everybody see the way you look back then." The picture is proof that as we humans grow older, we grow into our noses. But the other thing, there's a trend here too, is that the first time I was here, I spoke to the Civic Center, 1,500 people. The second time I'm here with you, maybe about 150 or so people. So the third time, if I come back to Bismarck, I think I'll probably be booked to speak and give remarks in the bathroom down at the Elbow Room bar down the road. So we've got the easy job here, and that is to lay out the problems. For those of us who have been on the campaign trail or been active in campaigns, we've all seen that candidate or that office holder who's really good at talking about the problems but never offering solutions. That's our job today. So we're embracing that and welcoming that, because the rest of you who are going to be discussing and interacting over the next day and a half are going to be talking about the solutions. So let me just throw out a couple, particularly from the legislative side and my experiences in Ohio. I would agree. I think ultimately, it comes down to issues of personalities and politics that are the biggest barriers for all of us dealing on a cross-branch basis. Kim mentioned earlier the physical layout here in North Dakota being conducive for collaboration and having proximity and ready access to the judiciary and to the executive. And like many of you in your states, we don't have that in Ohio. So there's the physical barrier that stands in the way of being able to do that. There's the different constituencies that we serve and just different places where our minds are while we're in the Capitol together, sometimes not being able to come together. Of course, there's ego. We're all politicians. We all have an ego. We all serve with people with those. My first committee assignment in the Ohio Senate was to chair the State and Local Government and Veterans Affairs Committee. And among other things, we did election law. And so we worked with the Secretary of State's office quite a bit. Same party. But in my decade of service down there up to that point, which was concurrent with that individual's service, we'd spoken once. And so, there's personality issues that you always have to deal with, folks that maybe don't want to deal with the other branch, folks that maybe are just, they have different agendas. Of course, there's policy and political differences. Our policy goals may be very, very different, particularly if you have a party split. The first 10 years that I was in the legislature, my party had complete control of all three branches, and now has only one statewide office. So for the first time, it's my third governor dealing with a governor of a different party now. It's a very different experience. And so my thoughts and outlook on collaboration between the legislative and executive branch are a little different than had this conference been held a couple years ago. Not terribly different, but just little subtle differences in how we interact and deal with each other. 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 And one of the things that I would raise as a red flag is the issue of executive orders. And I can't tell you, it is not lost on the legislature in Ohio that our current governor has issued more meaningful executive orders that change policy than our previous governor did in 8 years. And you can imagine how that creates some friction between the branches, because it represents somewhat of a breakdown in the process and in discussion and communication between the two branches. And of course, it's driven by a political agenda that is perhaps different than those that are in the majority in the legislature, and that's all fair. But you can imagine the frustration with the loss and the lack of a process to get to the outcome of some of those executive orders. Rulemaking is also a major, and Michael mentioned that earlier. It is so important for us to be able to ensure that the departments are administering and implementing the laws that we pass in a way that we intended. Legislative intent is and should be one of the most, it's one of the reasons we're here, right? We're here to balance the power of the executive. It's one of the major components of what our jobs are in the legislative branch. And so I find that there are barriers in dealing with many, particularly in not necessarily in elected positions, but often in mid-level administrative positions. They are people that stay no matter who the governor is, no matter what party is in control, that simply don't understand the idea of legislative intent, that don't understand that there's a reason a bill was written a certain way, or there was a vision behind the way a bill was drafted, and there was an intent in the way the bill was supposed to be implemented. And so that I have found to be somewhat of a barrier. The other issue, and I mentioned personalities in politics, for those of us who've been in the legislature or have come from the legislature, you know that the American legislature is a really unique animal. It is based, and it sounds, when you really describe it, it kind of sounds like all the things that people are supposed to dislike about politics, but the fact is, it's the way it was designed, and it works well, and that is that it comes down to relationships. We make our decisions based on accurate information and sound logic. And the sound logic is up to us, but the accurate information comes from a variety of sources, and often it comes from each other, which means that we have to have integrity. We have to know that when our colleagues are speaking to us on the floor or in committee or in the halls or over a beer at night, that the information that they're giving us, while we may not agree politically, that the information that they're giving us is sound and something that we can take to the bank and count on. That's really what makes our great American legislature work, is that relationship. And I'm a relationship guy, so that I appreciate that side of the state government process. Obviously, that's very, very hard for some of these reasons and others that we'll mention to take that outside of your branch and to apply that same kind of standard and to have that same kind of relationship that makes government work with the executive branch and the judicial branch. Often it's for formal reasons. Sometimes in some of our states there are very strict ethics rules that apply. Often the people who work for the governor's staff, people who work in senior level positions in the departments who interact with you have rules that are placed on them over and above what the law allows. Sometimes a governor comes in and says, look, you guys can't even take a cup of coffee, you can't do anything outside of work hours with anybody in the legislature, any of the staff or anything like that. And that can create barriers to building the needed relationships that you can get to know some of these people and work with them on a daily basis. I come from a term-limited state, and that is another formal institutional barrier, in my view, to interbranch cooperation because, and for a variety of reasons, we've all gone through, you've all heard the arguments against term limits, you've all heard the challenges that it's posed in different states. They do attack that integrity component and that relationship component to state government because you have people floating in and out of these positions and they do the bare minimum that they need to do over that period of time and then look for the next thing to do. And so that means not making an emotional investment in the institution of the legislature. It means not taking the time to sit down with the court and learn about their role and their outlook. It means not taking the time to get to know the folks in the departments and understand what their mission is and how they fit. And that's been a frustrating thing for many of us, particularly those of us who started before term limits set in Ohio. And political extremes. I can't, sometimes the word bipartisan is applied to all kind of collaboration, including interbranch. We are entering a time right now when the people who are on the opposite ends of the political spectrum are gaining more and more of a voice. And I think that's having an impact in some of our states. It certainly had an impact in Washington. I did a press release a couple weeks ago dealing with economic development, and very active in an effort to try to get young professionals involved in thinking about Ohio in the future. And like a lot of Midwest and manufacturing states, we've got a lot of challenges. It had the word bipartisan in it. And I got a couple emails from people that you wouldn't believe. I mean, one of them was a very prominent blogger, and it's amazing that's a word that's in our lexicon today, but blogger, who said, "How dare you use the word bipartisan? It's not worth it working with people in Columbus. We just need to have our agenda and impose it on everybody, and all will be well." And it really struck me that there are people out there who don't want us to work together, who really don't want the process to work, whether it's across the aisle or across branches. And I think that's something to be concerned about. I've got more to say about courts and collaboration because we actually have some good examples of what works in Ohio, but I'll leave that for maybe question and answer and move on.
Good morning. My name is Dan Kelly. I am an obstacle to interbranch cooperation. Just ask the local media.
You are a troublemaker.
The only person in Kentucky who's worse, according to the media, is my colleague who I replaced today, Senator David Williams, and if you know him. And I also am someone, I'm always talking about partisanship. I believe in partisanship, and I appreciate the conflict that was written into our system of government, that we'd have checks and balances. It's a good thing. And I do also recognize the need for us to put aside partisanship and differences of opinions and work together. So I think it's good we're having this discussion today. Originally, I wanted to speak to the issue of executive-legislative conflict. I'm most interested in that, but I think your remarks have covered that very well. And I've noticed there's more judicial folks here, really, than governors, so I want to get into that. And this is just off the top of my head, but some of the as a legislator, I've really learned to appreciate separation of powers and understand the importance of some of these conflicts. And let me just go through a little laundry list of some significant conflicts we've had in Kentucky between the judicial branch and the legislative branch. Early on, many of you have experienced these education lawsuits where someone comes in and says your education funding is unconstitutional. And in Kentucky, I don't know if it's the same in every state, but it was actually a collusive lawsuit. The legislature wanted to raise taxes for education funding, but didn't have the nerve to do it, so they were inviting an organization to sue them in the judicial branch so that they would have cover, and they hoped that the judicial branch would declare their system unconstitutional. So you actually had a great inter-branch cooperation, and we've regretted it ever since. Because now every time some issue comes up, they all go back and they quote that old suit and they say, we can sue the legislature and we can tell you guys what to do. That was an interesting, we've had a lot of litigation over budget. Many of you in tough budget times, you came to a situation where you couldn't agree on a budget, and then the big question arises, well, you've left a session, there's no budget, who has the authority to spend? We had another interesting collusive lawsuit. One member of the executive branch sued another member of the executive branch and said that the governor has complete power to spend without the authority of the legislature, and all the governor had to do was admit the allegations in the complaint, and suddenly the legislature would have lost all of their authority and prerogative in budgeting. So we had to hustle and run down there and intervene in the lawsuit and challenge that. It was real interesting to me as a legislator because I'm glad someone acknowledged there is politics in the judicial system, and You had this judge who had been appointed by a Democrat governor, and you had the representatives of the governor, and they would say, and we don't have any budget because the Senate didn't vote for the budget. Well, of course, the House didn't either, and the governor encouraged the House not to, but then he'd look down and he'd glare at us, and the judge would look over and he'd glare too, and it was kind of a lonely position. We had a terrible battle over qualification of members and raising our own pensions, and the only reason why I raised that is in both cases, there was a level of media, and not media, but public opinion, so anti the legislature that I actually believe that the judiciary just couldn't resist. That rather than stay out of a sensitive area, our pensions were raised, and they truly were raised by an artifice. Somebody slipped it through with the most artful language that you'd ever seen that nobody could tell what it was doing. But how unusual is that in the legislature? And the courts found, for some reason, that if we did something that we didn't really understand what we were doing, that it was unconstitutional. And to me, I think they were under tremendous pressure because, you know, the public was just incensed about it. So we had the worst experience you could possibly have. We voted to raise our pensions without realizing it, and then had it taken away. Can you imagine? We had a lawsuit over qualification of members where, again, there was so much public opinion that was raised about it that I think the court just felt they had to interject. And our state Senate president had said, by golly, if we say that someone who has to be 30 is 30, and even though they're 25, then they're 30. Because the Constitution, somebody here's reacting to that. Are you with the judiciary? And there was a terrible reaction to that, particularly among the judiciary, that he could be so arrogant. But really, Henry Clay was only 29 when he served in the U.S. Congress, and I think we're all glad that he served there. And anybody that really understands the interplay between these two branches of government, if we say it, and it's in our domain by Constitution, by golly, the only people we should have to answer to are the voters. And if they're incensed about it, they can all vote us out. But again, our courts could not resist the temptation to go along with public sentiment, and we almost got into one of those situations where, you know, you have to ask the Chief Justice, just where is your army that's going to take this person that's been elected and we say is qualified and take her out of the Senate? I don't know if they'd have sent a sheriff or not, but we finally gave up on that issue and didn't want to continue the constitutional crisis. We've had suits over pay for court employees, over school funding, over road construction we're engaged in right now. But one thing that is a real impediment to the cooperation is lack of communication that was mentioned earlier. And I just want to throw this issue out just to be provocative, and then we'll open it to you all. In Kentucky, like many other states, we're facing this issue of why do we have so many people incarcerated? And as I was studying this issue, I was looking back over state legislation, and since 1973, where we've had this 600% increase in the number of people incarcerated, year after year we have passed laws mandating alternative sentencing, mandating changes in the judiciary that would stop this trend, and yet it's just gone on and on and on. And so I would ask the question, where was the judiciary when this was happening? Why do we not hear from you except your pension benefits, your pay, and your working conditions? You know, why wasn't there a dialogue? And of course, it's just as much our fault that we didn't reach across and talk to the judiciary as well. But there's an example where I think two separate branches of government could look and say, we've got a problem here. The legislature keeps expressing this intent to reduce the number of people in the penitentiary, and it's still growing, and obviously we as a judiciary have a role in that. The executive branch through their prosecution did. And it's interesting why this dialogue is only just now beginning because the fiscal constraints we all have. But I think that it'll be interesting to see how we learn to overcome obstacles to communication and deal with this issue nationally.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think you've done a good job of laying the groundwork for some of our problems. And now that audience participation we talked about being so important earlier is, it's time for you to play play a role. So what was it that you heard that maybe provoked some thoughts in your mind or some questions, or maybe you have some examples to add to the discussion? Don't be shy. We have a microphone here in the center of the room. Please come on up, tell us who you are, what your position is, and feel free to address any of the members of the panel.
You can turn this on.
There you go.
Dan, you mentioned this issue about sentencing. In Colorado, we have a legislative liaison office between the judiciary and the legislature, and I guess it's a matter of the decision of the Chief Justice as to what kinds of issues they will relate to or address. And so certainly there's the issues of running the judiciary. But this issue that you're talking about, sentencing and new statutes that address sentencing, any new law that affects the administration of justice, child welfare laws, for example, that are going to affect the executive department. Is there not a mechanism in Kentucky that at least gives an initial forum for that kind of communication?
Well, the answer to that is no. The Chief Justice does have a legislative liaison, but strictly one to communicate the type of issues I was referring to before. And like I say, it may be unfair for me to implicate just the judiciary, but I think the judiciary sometimes feel like they're kind of isolated and have this role, and they should be independent. They don't necessarily think about a dialogue. But in this particular situation I'm referring to, you mentioned we pass laws that sometimes are conflicting. We say we want people probated and we want alternative sentences, and yet we create mandatory sentences and that sort of thing. But I really believe that this situation that's occurred nationally has been because none of us have looked at this problem and really gotten to the root of it and figured it out. And I think that all of the branches have an opportunity, the judiciary with all their experience in working with these problems. So I'm going to follow your suggestion and talk to our judiciary about setting up a more substantive liaison rather than just some of the other issues.
One of the difficulties would be if you're having a Senate hearing on a bill that the judiciary thinks is going to have some impact on the administration of justice or especially in criminal matters, they certainly are not going to raise their hand and say, by the way, will you invite us? Maybe they will. Maybe they should. But maybe they shouldn't have to. Maybe they should be invited.
And the other question is, by expressing opinion, have they just required themselves to be recused on an issue later on? I think that's
Right.
impediment.
And that's an issue that is being addressed as well.
Other members of the panel care to weigh in on that? Any comments?
I'm sure that other people had the same reaction when Dan was describing the dynamic of the increase in prison population in Kentucky. I know from my perspective on the Justice Center board that in many states this is a direct result of the mandatories themselves. I mean, there's no other explanation but the fact that for political, and this again is the political barrier we speak of. In the absence of a perception that the judiciary is tough on crime, there is going to be a rather simplistic and compelling political point to be made by the legislature manifested in these mandatory sentences. I will say this, I think to overcome that barrier requires a lot of conversation and a lot of change in attitude. That frankly is expressed in a variety of ways. It's not just at hearings. I think it's part of the conversation that needs to occur among these kinds of organizations. I mean, honestly, I don't see any other way. I'm amazed, by the way, that states like Texas and Kansas, which are perceived to be rather conservative states, are taking the lead on the reduction of prison bed capacity because they recognize that, they come at it from a different direction, but with the same result. There's one other thing I'd have to say. I think that in Massachusetts about mandatories, we had an excellent commission headed by the chief judge of the, for administration of the courts. And the legislature for 12 years has rejected the bipartisan, thoughtful, well-reasoned, and I think very effective approach of trying to strike that balance. And the reason for that is politics. There's just no other way to describe it except that.
When the Chief Justice that I talked about from another state and I were talking about this interbranch issue, I said that, I believe that some legislators would tell you, I don't believe this is true in North Dakota, but I think in some states, and certainly on the federal level, that there's no effective check or balance on the courts anymore. And if courts don't abuse that power, that's probably not a problem. But if they choose to, it can be. And that perhaps the Supreme Court might fancy itself the Supreme Branch. And his response was to say, well, yes, but the legislative branch, you have the power of the purse. And I said, well, all right, Your Honor, what would you do if we defunded you? He said, well, we'd find it unconstitutional. I said, see? Other questions? Or Kevin, did you want to chime in on that one? Or? Okay. Other questions? Other comments? Yes, Larry. Identify yourself. I know you, but others don't. So.
Well, I'm Larry Clemene, member of the North Dakota House of Representatives. We've been talking about legislature, executive, and judicial here. But in North Dakota, we also have the people have a voice through initiative and referendum. And many states also have that. In fact, in some states, it seems to be becoming a predominant way of doing business. And I'm wondering to what extent, are the people themselves, through these powers that they have, becoming an obstacle to interbranch cooperation?
I'd like, if I quickly jump, Larry, I think you're absolutely right. I personally feel that I neglected that point because, we know about California, but I have to throw out this point that in our state now, there is on the ballot an elimination of the income tax, which in our state constitutes 32% of the entire budget. And there's a lot of conversation about how that, how we as legislators, how judges, how the executive branch needs to weigh in aggressively about that. And the Speaker went so far as to say publicly that if it were to pass, that he would not implement it. That he would ignore it. And that has its own set of implications politically. He, however, is elected by about 12,000 people, and so that probably won't matter. But I would just say to you, yes, I think it's absolutely the case that this perception that the three branches aren't doing it well enough, so we as a direct pipeline to our democracy are going to seize that opportunity, is in and of itself a fundamental challenge in some states in some times, and now is probably as bad a time as ever for that to happen.
Yeah, and more of these issues and initiatives are being driven by out-of-state organized efforts, not necessarily for the policy outcome, but for some political benefit, whether it's a turnout, they're trying to achieve a certain turnout model in a presidential election, or gain more members for their union, whatever it is. There's often another issue out there that underlies it. And what we often find, as many of you know, is that these initiatives are sometimes not as well written and well crafted as they are by our wonderful professional staff in our legislature. And so they often have problems. We just had a smoking ban pass in Ohio, and there was some ambiguity about whether or not private clubs and veterans organizations would be able to have smoking. The court ruled no. And now there's incredible pressure on the legislature to come back and create exemptions. And we have to figure out now what the court was looking at, and whether it's justified doing it. It just creates more friction between the branches, in my opinion, or potentially it can.
As I watch all these other states struggling with these initiatives, I'm glad that we don't have that in Kentucky. And it reminds me of the wisdom of the founders who put in our federal Constitution a guarantee of a Republican form of government. I don't think many people understand how important that is to avoid the tyranny of the majority.
Other questions? Comments? Don't all stand together. Are there obstacles that you have experienced in your state, or you have observed, or you've thought about that maybe have not been addressed or haven't been developed to the point that you think they need to be well understood? Certainly all of you that serve in various branches maybe have experienced some yourself that you'd care to mention. Quiet group. We've got to loosen you folks up a little bit.
Let me just throw
Kevin,
something out on the legislative judicial dynamic. be clear about the expectations. I mean, if collaboration means always getting what we want, then obviously we don't get there. But if collaboration means having formal and informal exchange of ideas and thoughts and a stake and a seat at the table as things are being crafted, I would hope that most of us in our states have that going on to some degree. I know in Ohio, if it's any issue dealing with criminal or civil justice, if it's any issue dealing with judicial reform or court administration, the Supreme Court, the Bar Association, and a variety of other stakeholders are almost always part of the process crafted. It may not like the final outcome. Chief Justice in our state is a long-serving Chief Justice, very well respected, and has a lot of ideas about judicial reform in Ohio, and many of us share his view on that. You mentioned merit selection earlier. And that brings in, I think, the role that the integrity of the court system in our state plays in potentially being a barrier in interbranch cooperation. In Ohio, the legislature and the court have been of the same party all during my term. I don't know, and I can see potentially that if you had a split between parties between those two branches, you could have a whole different set of issues and concerns out there. In 2002, the 2 Supreme Court races in our state that were on the ballot accounted for 1/2 of the money spent on Supreme Court races in the country. We've got a serious perception issue in Ohio that justice is for sale. And that is going to continue to haunt our system in Ohio. And if you ever get to a point where the legislature and the court are of different parties, magnify that concern by 10, because it's going to be a talking point every week, every time the court does something. And so I do think that there's a case to make for judicial reform of some kind, whether it's merit selection or some other kind of reform that deals with that issue, and I think would pave the way for greater collaboration in those instances where you have policy and political differences.
Good. Senator Wardner.
Okay, Senator Rich Wardner from North Dakota, and communications, you've mentioned it, and I think that is a key between the 3 branches. I think it's key in any type of setting. But one of the things I'd like to hear from you is some examples that way that the branches can communicate, but keeping in mind so the public doesn't think that everybody's in bed together and there's a collusion going on out there, and being able to keep it transparent, because I think there's a lot of issues that would be much simpler. For example, like mandatory sentencing that came down and the legislature said, well, the courts aren't doing a good enough job, we're going to step in there. I'm wondering, in that particular case, if they hadn't got together and talked about it, maybe the legislature would have seen the other side of the story.
You know, for the judges in the room, I would respond or ask you this question. I know in my state, I've been active in my bar association, and I know a lot of judges personally, but I can tell you there is a real cloak of the personal that is drawn down, so that, for example, you know, going out and having a golf game with the Speaker of the House, there'd be just no way, no how you'd ever do that, and that would, I would argue, create a perception of being, you know, sort of in bed. I do think, however, that the engagement of the conversation at a professional level is what the people expect, and frankly will yield a better result. You know, I just think about what we are seeing in the Justice Center. I mean, having chief judges and justices invest in the notion that we're going to use the, you know, the resources of CSG, working with legislators who have an effect on that process, on mental health course, for example, which is the particular item. We're seeing the kind of collaboration that comes at a high level of professionalism. And I think we all recognize, as long as we've lived on this planet, that it is the elemental stuff that does matter. I think with judiciary, again, we have no elected judges in our state. And we have mandatory retirement at age 70. And I can tell you, Secretary of Elder Affairs, I think that's a stupid idea, too. I mean, we've got some great minds that need to continue to participate in our courts. Maybe the merit system, that initial appointment and then a reappointment in some fashion might be a solution there. But I will tell you that it's a very hard thing to break through the barrier of communication with the judiciary when they have, in their own view of their jobs, a real bright line that says we just cannot have informal conversation of any level. It's hard enough with the bar, and the bench in the bar does do that regularly, and some of us happen to be legislators at the time, so by osmosis, I suppose, we have that opportunity.
Well, perhaps one of the things that's interesting in my experience serving in North Dakota that may be different than in many of your states, I'm told that in some states it's very uncommon to have, for example, a member of the bench come and testify at a legislative hearing. I've served almost my entire legislative tenure on the Judiciary Committee in the House, and it's not uncommon at all to have, for example, our Chief Justice come down and say, we've got an issue. And one of the ones I remember many years ago was court unification. We had county courts and we created a statewide court system. Another I remember is when our Chief Justice advocated a indigent defense system in our state, which we have sort of reformed and changed. I cannot imagine making those public policy decisions without some input from the people that they affect. And now maybe some of your states are very different, and that's what we want to hear. I also know that we have people here who are judges today who served in legislatures in the past. So you have a unique perspective. Our own Attorney General used to be a senator. He serves in the executive branch now. So some of you, especially that have multi-branch experience, I think sometime, whether it's now or sometime during the conference as we sort of unpack these issues and discuss them, it would be very helpful for us to hear what your perceptions are, having worn a couple of different hats, and how they've maybe changed over time. So be thinking about that as we go forward. Chief Justice Cobb, tell us who you are.
I'm Sue Bell Cobb, the Chief Justice of Alabama. And I just want to present two thoughts. One is I do think that on the whole, the reason why I become as involved in this effort is I do think that judges and particularly court leaders need to be more involved on some of these issues because judges are the gatekeepers. And so you're looking for solutions. You want solutions. We're the gatekeepers, and obviously we need to be involved in it. But I wondered specifically to our friend from Massachusetts, Chief Justice Marshall is, of course, held in high esteem, throughout all the Chief Justices. And she's indicated that y'all have literally, when you say a bright line, a constitutional provision that prohibits judges from being involved in political activity, or at least that was my understanding of what she said. And I just wondered how either your state constitutions in your individual 3 states or your canons of judicial conduct have contributed to the barrier of getting judges more involved in those areas where ethically, we could be involved.
A quick response. Maggie Marshall, I would say that I think it is the canons of ethics and past practice, which is well-grounded, that would cause her to make that conclusion. I do not believe that there's a constitutional prohibition.
So I may have misunderstood.
Yeah,
So
but it's the combination.
She told us the Constitution,
Really?
didn't she, Mary?
All right. Well,
She said the Constitution.
then that's an added barrier that I wasn't even aware of. But suffice to say, the net effect is that you see really little communication at a political level, except, by the way, I'll give you an example. Like Kim said, you could not go to a Judiciary Committee hearing that affects specific items of the judicial branch that would not have Chief Judge Mulligan, who heads our administrative judge, being present either physically or a representative of his. And there's an engagement ongoing in that respect. So, if one were to define politics as that process, then of course that would not be accurate. We do have that. I think where it becomes much more problematic, and probably why she would describe it as this bright line, is the participation in political activity is really where there is extraordinary barriers that manifest itself in not going to these events and not being seen or active in any kind of political activity. So that's
Ohio
my
or
take.
Kentucky? I
Yeah, I'd
mentioned
just
that
say-
about the canons because in Alabama, one of our canons specifically says that the judiciary and judges specifically are not only authorized to pursue political activity which improves the administration of justice, but we are encouraged to do so. That's in our canons. And so many of these overarching areas of concern do impact administration of justice.
In Kentucky, we have restrictions on political activity that would encompass elections, but I don't think that would in any way prevent members of the judiciary from having a voice, writing a letter, appearing at a hearing, or making recommendations to politicians about policy issues. It just seems to me that there has been just a reluctance, I guess, of the court to interject itself into the political process. And it's not just a judicial branch problem either. I feel the same problem with prosecutors in the executive branch. We never hear from the prosecutors about, we're out there in the field and these are the problems that we're experiencing. We basically hear from prosecutors about pay and staff and work problems. And really those are tremendous resources to the legislature that I think we miss a lot of, and we're basically up there listening to various interest groups that have opinions on these things like mandated sentence without really getting the other side from some of the folks out in the trenches in the other branch of government.
Our judges in Ohio, all the way down to the local level, are actively engaged in advocating for public policy, actively. And there's nothing that holds them back from doing it. I think it's a good thing.
And my second question, if I've got time,
Please
Mr.
do.
Chairman, is I know that there was a reference to, and I think, Kevin, it might have been you, that talked about the dynamic of interpreting legislative intent, that y'all would write a statute, and I'm sure very artfully and carefully, like they all are, right? and that
Careful.
you intended...
Sarcasm is a barrier, but so just know.
Make up for me. And therefore, you intended it to have this, X or Y or Z result. And so you want the courts then, obviously the implication would be that you want the courts to effectuate that legislative intent. So we have that school of thought. And then from the judiciary, then we deal with the school of thought that has to do with strict construction. And so then we get huge criticism because, oh my gosh, y'all have basically interpreted what the legislature meant instead of strictly construing word for word and giving it its plain meaning. So I guess my question would be, what could we on behalf of the courts do differently so that we could, and maybe it's because there's simply not enough known about that third and least understood branch of government, and that's the courts. What could we do to better broach that? Because what we see is a real tension between the public and the legislature wanting us to be strict constructionists, but yet not want laws to be stricken on a technicality, so to speak.
That's a real good question. Obviously, there's a lot of responsibility on the legislator to draft well and to understand and to look through that lens as they're drafting a bill. How's this going to hold up in court? How's the court? I think that is a fundamental responsibility of any legislator drafting any bill. And a lot of them need to do it better. A lot of us need to do it a lot better. I don't want to tread too deeply into the solutions here because I don't want to step in. I don't want to step on other people's. But I will just say this. And I think this is a golden opportunity for CSG. Because I don't think that a court should be in a position of doing it for the reason that Rich mentioned is public perception. But the build program, our Midwest, if you've gone to the build, anybody who's been to the build program over the last decade or so, you probably heard a presentation from former Justice Pavlich from Wisconsin on what every legislator ought to know about the courts. And he does a great presentation and walkthrough on pitfalls in drafting legislation, and here's what courts did with these bills. Why do you think they did it? Great discussion. Gives you a whole new perspective on these issues. I don't think that your court should conduct that for your legislators for public relations reasons, but I do think an outside entity providing that service to legislators would probably be a healthy thing for the process.
Very good. All right, yes, Mary.
I'm Mary McQueen. I guess I'm the Dan Sprague of the judiciary. It's an easy way to say it. But this is something that Dan and I have talked about between the Conference of Chief Justices and the Council of State Governments. And in fact, in Washington State, I was the state court executive and state court administrator for 25 years, and we developed a curriculum for legislative leadership in the courts on legislative intent that laid out what the standards are that judges use and what the evidence is that the legislature can help with. Because when you say legislative intent, and at the what do you introduce? A newspaper article, colloquies from the floor, committee reports? Help us out here, because the last time I checked, the way that bills become laws, somebody has to bring these issues to the court. It's not like they look out there and say, this was a badly drafted piece of legislation. Somebody somewhere had a question about it. And so I think that's something that the National Center for State Courts and the Council of State Governments can work on that would very much lend itself to kind of a DVD that could be used. But it was a day-long presentation. We could certainly put a toolkit together, Dan, that would say these are the issues that would need to be covered. Here's a curriculum. Choose your best folks to fill in the blank. But it went a long way to helping both the judiciary and the legislature. The judiciary, when they're saying, give me something here, so I'm not having to figure out what is. And the legislature in trying to think about what are those evidentiary pieces that they can provide so that if down the road there are questions raised, there's something more than a newspaper article to help the courts out.
Thank you, Mary.
Let me
Comments?
just respond briefly to that. I do think that those are good suggestions, but in Kentucky, interestingly enough, our judicial policy is that you do not look to legislative history to try to divine intent, and that you strictly look at the plain meaning of the language. And there's some value to that, because a hearing in a committee may have all kinds of intention expressed by a single legislator or a witness. And frankly, that's not what the law is. The law is whatever you pass, legislature. It means what it says, and the courts have the duty of divining that plain meaning from the artful language that we draft. And it puts a lot of pressure on us, as Kevin was mentioning, to be sure that we do make our intent and meaning clear.